Boss battles are the perfect ender for an experience within a gameplay session, and the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise is no stranger to these large, evil, marauding foes. Ever since the first game, it's been a tradition to present a boss fight between every few levels to spice up the gameplay and test the player's skills. However, the quality of these matches has varied quite substantially, not just from game to game, but even boss to boss, and it's a bit more complex than you may expect it to be initially. The problem with designing boss fights for Sonic games, especially in the three-dimensional space, is that the usual gameplay style for said games is fast platforming, reaction-based, and not a lot of combat traditionally. So in a boss fight, keyword being fight, it's hard to translate that into something engaging that's challenging in a fair way that also builds upon skills the normal gameplay loop would have been teaching you. A lot of the time, it either requires you to stand still or use a completely different set of skills compared to the regular gameplay loop, and we've seen many different ways SEGA has tried to tackle this. For example, some Sonic boss fights are treated as running battles, where the fight is constantly moving and Sonic needs to catch up to the enemy by being good at platforming and maintaining speed in order to land a hit until they can win. The first boss battle of Sonic Unleashed is an example of this archetype. Another one would be the Egg Hawk in Sonic Heroes, which is constantly flying away, but this one spices it up by giving it phases. Sonic Heroes has a slight combat system as well, which allows them to present different weaknesses based on what attacks you're using, which gives it a little bit more detail than the Sonic Unleashed boss fight that really does just require you to boost into the enemy. Then you've got fights like the Death Egg robot from the original Sonic Generations, which doesn't move you around at all and instead gives you a small arena to platform in where you need to avoid obstacles and wait for your moment to strike. Both of these are valid approaches, but as I explained, neither of them really compare to the levels you're playing before those boss fights, and if they can't match that quality, people will always see that as perhaps a little bit of a negative. Shadow Generations has possibly the strongest offerings of boss battles in any Sonic game. They really tried to up their design philosophy, and I think it paid off. But elephant in the room, I'm sure a lot of you are probably questioning, what about Sonic Frontiers? Now yes, Sonic Frontiers also did its own attempt at upping the stakes and quality of a Sonic boss battle. Sonic Frontiers benefits from the fact it had a combat system. I already mentioned how Sonic Heroes had a very basic one, and they could use that to elevate its boss fights. Well, Sonic Frontiers had an actual developed fighting system with different moves and skill trees and unlocks, and its boss fights, which took advantage of Super Sonic on top of that, definitely hit the mark in terms of giving you varied combat. And thanks to the combat system being the same as the regular levels, you weren't having to use a completely new skill set either. There was just enough new stuff to make it feel cool, but the foundations were something you've already been practicing beforehand. These fights also were very cinematic. That's a really great element to a boss fight, and I think the golden ratio is if you can make it cinematic without taking away the player's control for each of those cinematic moments. Because if the cinematics are completely automated, it's cool the first time, but then on repeat playthroughs it's a lot less interesting. The Wyvern Titan in Sonic Frontiers is an example of that. The first time you play it, whoa, this is crazy, we're flying around, the music's swelling, it's shooting missiles at me, I'm throwing its tail around, and then you realize that most of the fight you're just moving around, watching it fly, and there's a small window to hit it, so it loses a lot of its appeal. The first fight, Giganto, is actually better than Wyvern, even though Wyvern comes afterwards, because you're more involved in that fight. The quick time events are not as obnoxious, and then the actual fighting is you throwing hands against this giant robot that's also trying to throw hands at you. Very satisfying, but because it's the first boss fight, it's also a lot easier, so unfortunately it doesn't last long. In Shadow Generations, there is no true combat system. It's more like original Generations or Sonic Colors in far as its combat depth. But they still took the lessons they learned from Sonic Frontiers to enhance the experience. The cinematics are 100% the best they've been. Frontiers may have paved the way, but Shadow Generations truly mastered the presentation. Dynamic camera angles, great lighting, introductions timed with music. Other boss fights have had pieces of those, but a scarce few put them all together in such a good way. And then when the battle actually commences, the player does maintain a good amount of control. Despite the fact that we don't have combat moves, each boss fight brings a different way to engage with the enemy that still uses techniques you've been practicing in the main game. With the Bio Lizard, it starts off as an homage to the original, which was already based on your moveset anyway, but once it gets its new skill set, you need to just watch out for its giant attacks, homing attack when appropriate, and then beat the living hell out of the creature once you get in, making use of Chaos Control specifically to finish it off. The only weak spot of that entire fight is, I think, near the end. I wish it was slightly more involved on the player's point, rather than just being a cutscene. It's still nice, but like I say, on a rerun, you hoped it was a little bit more player involved near the end there. The next one, Metal Overlord, uses the Doom Surf, a completely different moveset to the first boss fight, and a completely different moveset to the Sonic Heroes boss fight against the same enemy. But they give it an engaging chase sequence where you need to dodge his attacks, watch his tails, you can get extra damage if you're skillful, timing Chaos Control and doing some important platforming to smuggle in an extra hit. And it's doubly good because if you use Chaos Control carelessly, Metal Overlord will just cancel it out. So it's not a free win, you only get the advantage if you truly understood the mechanics. Then you've got Mephiles the Dark, which is such a good take on Sonic 06's version of the fight, because in that game, Shadow once again had somewhat of a combat system, and the whole fight was built around using that combat system to make Mephiles vulnerable, where he was otherwise invincible. Here we use the Doom powers to make him vulnerable, and it's such a perfect way of translating that even without his old power set. They brought back his enemies, his special attacks, but they made them based around the Doom powers, so you need to swim up his attacks, you need to swim past the enemy, break his guard, use Doom Spear to take down enough things to recharge your Chaos Control, as opposed to recharging your Chaos Boost. It's really well done, but again with the automation criticism, every time you Doom Blast Mephiles, the camera auto locks to the sphere you need to kick him in to continue the fight. Perhaps it could have just been free locked so that you had to manually aim it, make it a slightly bit more harder, but also a bit more involved. For all I know, hard mode does this, because I haven't actually gone back to play hard mode yet, so I don't know how the boss fights have changed. And then there's only one more boss to talk about, which is Neo Devil Doom, and this one is instead focused around Doom Wings, Chaos Spear, at least at first, but when the phase changes, it's now a platforming challenge, making use of the Squid Doom thing, which at the time of me reaching that boss fight, I didn't fully understand, so it was a little bit difficult. But that makes use of a skill you've hopefully practiced more than I did with a platforming challenge. And of course, the cinematics, the music, it's all there. It really brings the experience together. It fires on all cylinders. And I do believe they are the best boss fights, at least overall, out of any other Sonic game released to date. There is a slight challenge when it comes to making these cinematic boss fights. I've already harped on about the interactive element, but depending on your point of view, I might have not gone on it hard enough. In the classic games, boss fights were simple because the games were simple, but a trade-off you got out of that was you could hit bosses pretty frequently so long as you could reach them. Their invincibility frames did not last long, and so really skilled players could blitz some of the boss fights and have them over in a couple seconds, and depending on how hard the boss fight was, it can feel very satisfying to do that. Sonic Advance even allowed the same thing, but with more cinematic fights like the ones in Shadow Generations, they are only vulnerable at certain points. Now, Sonic Frontiers made them vulnerable more often, but they had way larger health pools as well. You could argue it's the same effect as the classic games, because if you were really good at timing all of your psi loops and power attacks, you could definitely chip down a boss quicker than a normal run. So that's an argument you could make. In fact, I think it's interesting to hear what your opinion is. Do you like the freedom that Sonic Frontiers boss fights had, in that they were basically weak to your attacks at any moment? Or would you prefer the Shadow Generations approach, where there are certain moments you can hit them and the game itself is testing your skills rather than testing how quickly you can deal damage? Let me know in the comments below. I am genuinely interested to see your preference there. I don't actually know what my answer would be. I think I'm more inclined to say I like the Shadow Generations approach, but if it was a little bit more interactive than what we currently have. It's close, but I think it just needs a little bit more to really hit the mark. But that is just my opinion, and this brings us to the end of the video. What do you think about the boss fights? Please answer my question, comment below, and let me know if you think there's anything else I might have overlooked for this topic. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end, and I hope you have a great day. This is the Mighty Emperor, signing off.